Magnificent Delusions by Husain Haqqani, continued. In the final few months of the Bush administration, most of its officials felt obligated toward Pakistan. They had supported Musharraf and had been disappointed. They now wanted civilian rule to succeed. National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley created a regular monitoring system so that both sides could review their specific commitments. Zardari had asked my predecessor, Major General Mahmoud Durrani, to serve in the newly created post of National Security Advisor on the Pakistani side. Durrani and Hadley conferred regularly to translate promises into actions. At one point, soon after the formation of the Gilani government, Pakistan found itself unable to meet the payment schedule for upgrading the F-16 fighter jets from the Reagan-Zia era. The Bush administration helped out by shifting $230 million in aid to Pakistan from counter-terrorism programs to upgrading the aging F-16 fleet. Our Air Force claimed that it would use the planes to bomb terrorists. One congressional critic derided the argument, however, stating, "Using F-16s this way is like hitting a fly with a sledgehammer." Everyone knew that the F-16s were part of Pakistan's arsenal against India. Representative Nita Lowy, a New York Democrat who headed the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Foreign Operations, demanded a demonstration of how these F-16s would be used to fight al-Qaeda and the Taliban in order to get congressional support. But the mood in Washington was to help the new civilian government, which did not want to delay upgrading Pakistan's old F-16s. As the request for reallocating funds from counter-terrorism programs to pay for the F-16s came through the newly elected civilians, as a favor to Pakistan's newly elected leaders, Congress did not press its objections. The United States had been flying drones over the tribal areas bordering Afghanistan for several years, and during Musharraf's last year, the US drone campaign had been presented in Pakistan as a violation of Pakistani sovereignty. Still, the CIA and ISI communicated regularly on the subject of drones. The ISI did not like Pakistani civilian officials finding out anything about their dealings with the United States about armed predator drones, but the US government wanted the civilian leadership to remain in the picture. At one point, CIA Deputy Director Steve Capps complained that the coordination process with Pakistan in the use of drones was getting lengthier. "Sometimes we do not get the decision up to 4 days," he said, implying that the ISI had signed off on drone strikes much faster in the past. Capps also lamented that Pakistanis had a different threat perception than did the United States, and did not consider the war against terrorism as their war. "But al-Qaeda is equally focused on Pakistan," he insisted. Zardari and Gilani initially asked that the United States should provide Pakistan its own drones, so that the program could be described to sovereignty-conscious Pakistanis as a joint program. But the ISI and the army leadership preferred things the way they were. The generals only wanted more say in who the US drones targeted. Under Musharraf, Pakistan had distinguished between good and bad Taliban. Those with ties to the ISI enjoyed protection, whereas the ones trying to operate independently or attacking Pakistan's security forces were targeted for elimination. By protesting against the drones publicly, while privately negotiating over whom the drones might target, the ISI sought to manipulate a delicate balance among various Taliban factions. In the summer of 2008, Chairman Joint Chiefs Admiral Michael Mullen travelled to Pakistan with Capps to demand action against several specific groups, including the Haqqani network, responsible for killing US troops in Afghanistan. Pakistan agreed to act sequentially against the various groups the Americans identified, beginning with the easier targets first. But Durrani conveyed the ISI's denial of the existence of the Taliban's main decision-making body, the Quetta Shura. The United States was certain about its intelligence and was not impressed by Pakistani denials. Pakistan did promise to close down a madrasa run by the Afghan Haqqanis, but it cited limitations of capacity in response to all other requests for action, asking for more equipment and assistance before its forces could act in the tribal areas along the Afghan border. Moreover, The Pakistan Army put in its own request for US drones to target Baitullah Masood, whose Pakistani Taliban group threatened the Pakistan military directly. At this point, the United States had a list of high-value targets marked for assassination by drones, primarily consisting of al-Qaeda leaders and Afghan Taliban commanders. Conspiracy theorists claimed that the United States did not eliminate Masood because eliminating threats to Pakistan were not a US priority. However, US officials added Pakistani Taliban to their list of targets after the ISI's request, and a Hellfire missile fired from an American Predator subsequently killed Masood. But his death silenced the conspiracy theories only temporarily. Soon, other stories of alleged American perfidy were in circulation in Islamabad. Pakistan's security establishment's unwillingness to speak openly about allowing drone operations was matched by America's own secrecy about the entire program. But the CIA-ISI cooperation in the matter was an open secret in Washington, and US media reported on the arrangement in some detail. Over the years, the drones became a major issue in the rhetoric surrounding the relationship. The United States insisted that their strikes only targeted terrorists with precision. Meanwhile, the ISI kept quiet about some strikes, possibly the ones they approved, while encouraging protests about others that killed some of their jihadi allies. The civilians were seldom briefed in detail about the ISI-CIA relationship and had little say in its conduct, though reports in the Pakistani media continually accused the elected leaders of bending over backward to fulfill an American agenda. Thus, the Army and the ISI retained control over the relationship with the United States, while also keeping anti-Americanism alive as a means of fending off US demands that they considered against their regional policies. In October, Lieutenant General Ahmed Shuja Pasha became Director General of the ISI. Pasha was short in physical stature, pleasant in demeanor, and had a tendency to wear his patriotic fervor on his sleeve. He was close to Kayani, the army chief, who had assured Mullen about Pasha's professionalism and his commitment to eliminate terrorists. But Pasha's tenure as head of the controversial organization began with a bang. On November the 26th, the American Thanksgiving Day holiday, 12 coordinated terrorist attacks in the Indian financial capital, Mumbai, killed 166 people and left more than 300 injured. The terrorists took over several hotels and a Jewish community center. They used firearms and hand grenades, took hostages, and did not stop until all but one of them had died 3 days later. Communications between the terrorists and their handlers were recorded. Indian commandos arrested the last remaining gunman, Ajmal Kasab. Americans were among the dead. The Pakistan-based Lashkar-e-Taiba, LET, a group with close ties to the ISI, had executed the attack. Pakistan, however, initially denied any connection to the attack. Instead of trying to identify and punish terrorists, Pakistan focused on refuting reports of Pakistani complicity. When Kasab revealed during interrogation that he was from Pakistan, the ISI's media wing swung into action to deny journalists access to his village. The Mumbai attacks lost Pakistan the Bush administration's sympathy for good. Deputy Secretary of State John Negroponte excluded all officials from a meeting with Durrani to address the National Security Advisor and me in private. Although Negroponte was known as a friend of Pakistan, on this occasion his language reflected a degree of agitation, which was something unusual for a diplomat of Negroponte's experience. "Why do we sense a degree of guilt in Pakistan's conduct?" he asked deliberately. Negroponte wondered why Pakistan refused access to the LET planners it had arrested. Was it concerned that they might speak of their relations with the ISI? "It is time for Pakistan to come clean," he said. "The past can go away only by moving forward." Durrani said that Pakistan's courts would determine the legality of requests for access, drawing a sharp rebuke from Negroponte. "We know about Pakistan's courts," he said, adding, "They order the hanging of elected prime ministers when the army asks them, and don't look at legal niceties." Durrani spoke of the Pakistani government's political compulsions. The United States, he said, must give elected leaders time and space to fulfill their promises. Over the next 3.5 years as ambassador, I heard visiting Pakistani officials make the same request repeatedly. If Negroponte's tone in his meeting with Durrani was agitated, the tone of Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice on this occasion was downright angry. She began with the words, "I will not sugarcoat anything I say to you today," and then went on to prove that right. She addressed Durrani and me to say, "We have no doubt about the commitment of President Zardari, Prime Minister Gilani, or the two of you to opposing terrorism, but there is a serious problem with Pakistan." She said that there was clear evidence in relation to the Mumbai attacks. She acknowledged that there was no direct link between the attackers and the Pakistan government, but when people have been trained and intelligence operatives have relations with people who have been trained for such attacks, then there is a connection. She suggested that Pakistan stop asking for proof and stop claiming that there is no proof. This does not serve you, Rice emphasized. What you think and what the whole world thinks are two different things. According to Rice, Pakistan had all the information it needed to shut terrorist operations down forever. After all, ISI knew who it had trained and equipped for terrorism. "I realize that there could be instability if you go after the jihadi groups," she observed, "but you will be consumed if you do not." It seemed that she felt the need to convey her strongly held views before she ended her tenure. She had been diplomatic with Pakistani officials for 8 years, but now she wanted to get it out. Rice said that focusing your energies on an Indian threat that does not exist is a colossal mistake. Pakistan had to make a strategic decision that association with terrorists has to come to an end. According to her, Pakistan could not keep these people as an option because keeping contacts with various jihadi groups is not acceptable. She said the United States and Britain would help if Pakistan lacked the capacity to take on the terrorists. Durrani responded to Rice's angry tone with some heated remarks of his own. He said that the ISI was involved in training LET, just as we were all involved together in dealing with Afghanistan during the 1980s. He insisted that Pakistan's point of view on Jammu and Kashmir was right, and that allowed us to use the option of supporting militants. But he claimed that the ISI's links with LET were broken in 2002. To the best of my knowledge, Durrani stated, there is no operational connection between ISI and LET. He said that Pakistan had changed the ISI leadership 4 times and had changed 3 layers of personnel. Pakistan is not keeping the jihadis as an option, he emphasized. But Rice did not relent. Without raising her voice, but remaining extremely curt, like a schoolteacher reprimanding her favored pupil, she proceeded again. You are truthful as far as you know, but not right. According to Rice, there were continued contacts between LET and ISI. There is material support to LET, and the LET has just recently killed 6 Americans, she added. I sent a detailed account of the Rice-Durrani conversation to Islamabad. As I have said in many telegrams since becoming ambassador, I remarked, the view from Washington is very different from the way issues and matters are being perceived in Islamabad. Soon after Durrani's trip, the United States shared intelligence with Pakistan that proved the LET's culpability. Individuals involved in planning the attacks were arrested after it became obvious that lack of action could again bring India and Pakistan to blows. ISI Chief Pasha then visited the United States for a meeting with CIA Director Michael Hayden. He admitted that the planners of the Mumbai attacks included some retired Pakistani army officers. According to Pasha, the attacks had ISI links, but this had not been an authorized ISI operation. Pasha came for tea to the embassy before returning to Pakistan. He spoke of the difference between having links and exercising authority, direction, and control. According to Pasha, it was important to put the Mumbai incident behind us and move on. There was clearly no intention to act against LET. I took the opportunity to share with Pasha the names of ISI officers who had been egging on journalists back home to attack me as an American agent. He promised to take care of the problem, just as he had promised Hayden to deal with the fallout of the Mumbai attacks. Subsequently, the CIA received reliable intelligence that the ISI was directly involved in the training for Mumbai. The trial of the LET masterminds arrested in Pakistan for the attacks dragged on. On several occasions, Americans detected the terrorist prisoners using cell phones to direct further terrorist attacks. In July 2009, Gilani fired Durrani, possibly at the behest of some ISI officers, for publicly acknowledging Kassab's Pakistani citizenship. Thus, the government had lost one of its main interlocutors with the Americans. The position of National Security Advisor was never filled again. This left discussion with the United States of counter-terrorism issues solely in the hands of the ISI. Later, Kassab's Pakistan connection could not be kept a secret anyway. He gave detailed testimony to an Indian court about his life in Pakistan and his training for terrorism. Pakistani journalists were able to trace his family, some of whom expressed pride in his contribution to jihad. Officially, however, Pakistan maintained the fiction that it had no knowledge of Kassab. When he was executed in India 3 years later, Pakistan did not allow his family to claim his body for burial in his hometown. Right before Barack Obama's inauguration, Vice President-elect Joe Biden arrived in Islamabad on a one-day trip. As a senator, Biden had strongly supported the restoration of democracy in Pakistan. He had been persuaded by Bhutto's argument that elected civilians could fight terrorism more effectively than could dictators such as Musharraf. Zardari conferred one of Pakistan's highest civilian awards, Nishani Pakistan, on Biden. Biden shared Obama's position with Zardari. Obama would make a concerted effort to win the war in Afghanistan and to defeat al-Qaeda, he said. Pakistan could help the United States in fixing Afghanistan, and in return the United States would help Pakistan address its fundamental problems. If the ISI broke its ties with the Taliban, the United States could prevail in Afghanistan with a lot less bloodshed. America's next vice president was speaking of a grand bargain that would strengthen a democratic Pakistan, benefit its people, and rid the region of terrorism. Zardari said that he could help only if he was sufficiently strong at home. He did not want to be hated for being an American stooge. He said that Pakistan needed economic resources so that I can show the people that there's something in it for them. Biden said he understood Zardari's political needs. As vice president, he would help get a significant aid package through Congress for Pakistan. But, Biden added, if you do not show spine, then all bets are off. Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina who was accompanying Biden, asked Zardari to end the indecision that plagues your country. Pakistan had to figure out its enemies and its allies, Graham said. We're your allies, he emphasized. We're not your enemies. When Zardari brought up the subject of India, Biden said that the change Americans sought included a fundamental transformation in Pakistan's attitude toward India, and vice versa. Soon after his inauguration, Obama appointed Richard Holbrooke as his special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Holbrooke had brokered the Dayton Peace Accords in Bosnia-Herzegovina, among other diplomatic achievements. He knew how to coax and bully recalcitrant foreign leaders. However, he abhorred war and conveyed genuine caring for the people of other nations. Although many Americans commented on his ego and his penchant for publicity, among Pakistanis he was seen as a master negotiator who made even the weakest leaders feel good. Holbrooke and I met the day his appointment was announced. He told me that his objective was to ensure a successful end to the war in Afghanistan and a stable Pakistan and a stable Afghanistan. He said that contrary to views expressed in some circles, the United States had no ulterior motives regarding Pakistan. The US will never ask Pakistan to do anything that harms Pakistan's national interest, he remarked. But as a friend, the United States wanted to have candid discussions about what Pakistan's national interests and priorities might be. Regarding India, Holbrooke said, I will deal with India by pretending not to deal with India. Then he added that India also came within the purview of his brief to the extent that it impinged on Pakistan and Afghanistan's security. He asked me rhetorically if the United States could be friends with both India and Pakistan at the same time. He wondered if Hamid Karzai was the best man to lead Afghanistan under the circumstances, and whether alternatives were available. Holbrooke said that Pakistan had become the focus of the policy community in Washington, and he did not envy my job. Increased focus and scrutiny, he commented, raised questions to which there were no easy answers. From that day, Holbrooke and I became good friends. He assembled a huge staff drawn from various agencies within the US government, as well as non-government advisors. He travelled frequently to Pakistan and around the world to drum up support for a comprehensive strategy to end the Afghan war. On the eve of Holbrooke's first visit to Pakistan as special representative, a Pakistani court ordered the removal of all restrictions on nuclear proliferator A.Q. Khan. The timing of the decision was meant to convey to the United States that Pakistan's fundamental attitudes would not change any time soon. The chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Howard Berman, cautioned that Khan's release could lead to reduction of US aid to Pakistan. But Holbrooke chose to ignore the event. His sights were on the broader strategic picture. Over the next 2 years, Holbrooke developed close ties with Zardari, Kayani, and a host of Pakistani politicians and public figures. Along with National Security Advisor James Jones, and with the full support of Secretary of State Clinton, Holbrooke organized a multi-layered strategic dialogue between Pakistan and the United States. The dialogue covered many tracks, from agriculture to security. Holbrooke's team became involved with schemes for conserving water and managing Pakistan's energy crisis. They sought to win the trust of Pakistani officials by handling issues such as opening the US market for Pakistani mangoes. But the Pakistani military and ISI mistrusted Holbrooke from the start. Kayani preferred to deal with Mullen, assuming that a man in uniform would prove to be the more effective interlocutor. When the US Congress approved what came to be known as the Kerry-Lugar-Berman Bill, which authorized $1.5 billion annually for 5 years, a total of $7.5 billion, the Pakistani military reacted negatively to the bill's conditions against military intervention in politics. The aid package was the largest the United States had ever offered Pakistan for civilian purposes such as education, healthcare, poverty alleviation, and infrastructure. All US foreign aid legislation included reporting requirements for the executive branch, and this bill was no exception. But hardliners in the Pakistan army had convinced themselves that Holbrooke and I had connived to insert humiliating conditions about civilian control over the military. Pakistan's religious nationalists termed it a conspiracy to put Pakistan's army under American control. Holbrooke worked with Mullen and Senator John Kerry, a Democrat from Massachusetts, to defuse the situation. I offered to resign, but Zardari laughed off the affair as a routine effort to derail civilian rule. In an attempt at humour, I sent a copy of Samuel Huntington's book, The Soldier and the State, The Theory and Politics of Civil-Military Relations, to Kayani, along with a 4-page summary. The book deals with the role of a professional military in a democracy. Kayani acknowledged receiving the book and appreciated the summary, but I have no reason to believe that it affected his thinking or decisions in any significant way. Kayani was personally always agreeable with civilians. The Pakistan Army, as an institution, still remained a long way from accepting the right of civilians to debate, let alone define, national interest. Holbrooke's efforts at finding a comprehensive solution for the Afghan problem, including an end to terrorist safe havens, received little support from Pakistan's generals. They sensed that he did not have the full backing of all parts of the US government. Media reports and some books spoke of Holbrooke lacking Obama's full support, and Holbrooke's critics suggested that he was all over the place and lacked pointed aims. But in Islamabad, the sense was that the ISI could still deal separately with the CIA, and Mullen remained Kayani's principal conversational partner. Pasha and the ISI continued to propel hyper-nationalist sentiment. Pasha once told me that this was one of the few tools Pakistan had for leveraging itself in an asymmetric relationship. Americans often ignored the rumors and misinformation routinely circulated through Pakistan's media, though sometimes they reacted to point out the absurdity of the tactic. Holbrooke once mentioned a story in which Pasha had snubbed Mullin, the highest-ranking US military officer and the special representative of the US. He said he realized that it may have something to do with perceived domestic needs in Pakistan, but it should not be forgotten that there were domestic political compulsions on the US side as well. He asked, "Now why would your side lie about something like that?" Parallel to the US-Pakistan strategic dialogue, Holbrooke also initiated tripartite talks between Afghanistan, Pakistan and the United States. After the first round of the tripartite talks, Pasha complained that this format amounted to boxing Pakistan in. The civilians were able to keep the dialogue going, but more often than not, discussions about Afghanistan always ended up being about the ISI's role there. One of Holbrooke's deputies remarked that the frequency of interaction had only one advantage. It had inadvertently made Pakistan's generals incrementally less deceitful. US media and members of Congress criticized Pakistan for its appeasement of terrorists, when, on several occasions, it showed a preference for talking to Taliban instead of fighting them. Although several agreements were signed in different parts of the country, the Taliban broke all of them. Americans could not understand why Pakistani leaders had difficulty making a clear choice, but Zardari and Gilani did not find sufficient support at home for a bold decision. They thought US economic support was insufficient and anti-Americanism in Pakistan was too strong to sign up as closer US allies than they already were. During the first year of the Obama administration, some US officials had already reached the conclusion that the United States could not achieve its goals in Afghanistan as long as Pakistan continued to support the Taliban with weapons and logistical support. There were calls for cutting off military aid and reimbursements under the Coalition Support Funds program as a substitute for trying to buy off Islamabad with more economic aid. Clinton and Holbrooke were largely responsible for preventing that from happening. Congress approved $828 million for aid to Pakistan in 2009. That same year, an international conference in Tokyo pledged $5.5 billion to be provided by various international donors. But for Pakistanis, the money was never enough. Every now and then, Pakistani officials showed up with charts to illustrate the presumed economic loss the country suffered because of terrorism and the war against it. They asked the United States to compensate Pakistan for lost investment, lost revenue, and lost economic opportunities. Americans considered the aid they were already giving to be a huge amount of money, and did not accept that US taxpayers should bear even greater costs for Pakistan's sake. No one in Washington believed that Pakistan's problems were America's responsibility, and that they were caused exclusively by the country's role in the anti-Soviet jihad and the war after 9/11 against terrorism. US officials were often too polite to say so directly, but in their view, successive Pakistani leaders had made a series of wrong choices, and blaming the United States was just a way of refusing to take responsibility for those Pakistani decisions. In May, Zardari and Obama had their first meeting as presidents. Obama had hosted a trilateral meeting that also included Karzai. Likewise, he invited Zardari to the White House for a direct conversation. Obama said that the average US congressman wanted to help Pakistan in beating back terrorism, but US aid was being used to bolster conventional arms against India. "We do not begrudge your concerns about India," he stated, "but we do not want to be part of arming you against India." Obama also said that the United States did not believe that India wanted to attack or threaten Pakistan any longer. He said he knew history and realized that at some point Pakistan may have been justified in its fears of India. "But I want you to hear it from me," he went on, "that they are focused on economic development." Zardari summed up his talking points about why Pakistan still viewed India as a threat, and then added, "We are trying to change our worldview, but it's not going to happen overnight." That summer, Pakistani troops moved against the Taliban in the Swat Valley after they had come relatively close to the Pakistani capital. The pretext of a lack of national consensus vanished as cable news stations suddenly discovered videos of Taliban atrocities. TV commentators and newspaper editorialists changed their stance. Instead of describing the war against terrorists as an American war, as they had done so far, they finally spoke of the threat to Pakistan from terrorism. Finally, the mindset has changed. The Washington Post quoted a retired security official as saying, the paper described him as someone who often reflects military thinking. His next quote was, there is a realization that the threat to Pakistan in modern times is not Indian divisions and tanks. It is a teenaged boy wearing a jacket full of explosives. The prospect of Pakistani seriousness in counter-terrorist and counterinsurgency operations heartened US officials. In response, the United States mobilized a sizable relief effort for those displaced by the fighting. Once the fighting was over, the Pakistan Army received favorable press in the United States. Soon, requests for military equipment followed, and a few months later the momentum dissipated when domestic politics and a long-drawn battle with Pakistan's Supreme Court distracted the civilian government. The army returned to its previous debate about whether terrorism had replaced India as the new existential threat to Pakistan. In the fall, Clinton arrived in Pakistan for a 3-day visit. Her well-choreographed visit included many public events, including town hall meetings with students, civil society leaders, women, and Pashtun elders. She answered tough questions from Pakistani journalists and asked some difficult ones herself. Clinton's visit was the second effort from a senior US official to confront the myths and conspiracy theories that had fed anti-Americanism in the country. Her husband, Bill, had made the first through his televised address to the Pakistani people during his 5-hour visit in 2000. She expressed surprise that no one in Pakistan knew Osama bin Laden's whereabouts. Clinton described the Kerry-Lugar Burman aid as a demonstration of American goodwill towards the people of Pakistan, noting that it does not help when we do something like this and people question our motives. She asked the government to do more to shut down al-Qaeda, but she also spoke of the need to broaden the relationship. Soon after Clinton's visit, Jones, the national security advisor, brought a letter from Obama to Sadari, offering that Pakistan and the United States become long-term strategic partners. The letter laid out elements of the grand bargain that Biden had spoken of a few days before Obama's presidential term began. The letter even hinted at addressing Pakistan's oft-stated desire for a settlement of the Kashmir dispute. Obama wrote that the United States would tell countries of the region that the old ways of doing business are no longer acceptable. He acknowledged that some countries, a reference to India, had used unresolved disputes to leave open bilateral wounds for years or decades. They must find ways to come together. But in an allusion to Pakistan, he said, some countries have turned to proxy groups to do their fighting instead of choosing a path of peace and security. The tolerance or support of such proxies cannot continue. I am committed to working with your government, said the US President, to ensure the security of the Pakistani state and to address threats to your security in a constructive way. He asked for cooperation in defeating al-Qaeda, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Haqqani network, the Afghan Taliban, and the assorted other militant groups that threaten security. Obama then wrote of his vision for South Asia, which involved new patterns of cooperation between and among India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan to counter those who seek to create permanent tension and conflict on the subcontinent. My interpretation of Obama's letter was that it presented an opportunity for Pakistan to overcome past misgivings and build a real alliance with the United States. Since the 1950s, Pakistan had wanted an American role in South Asia. Now it was being offered one. In the end, Pakistan would have to negotiate the Kashmir issue directly with India. But at least now the American president was saying that he would nudge the Indians toward those negotiations. Pakistan could finally be a strategic US ally rather than an occasional transactional partner. But the view from Islamabad was different. In his meetings in Islamabad, Jones had remarked that US strategic interests lay east of Afghanistan. He meant to assure his hosts of Pakistan's centrality to US policy. The Obama administration was in the middle of its review of US policy in Afghanistan. Jones had hinted that Pakistan was the epicenter of that review, and had also stated that the main issues relating to al-Qaeda, extremism and terrorism were in Pakistan. The Foreign Office asked me to convey Pakistan's concern that it was being treated as the problem. In a meeting with me after his visit, Jones stressed that he had wanted to reassure Pakistanis that any perception that the United States was leaving the region was simply wrong. Pakistan's success is fundamental to America's success in the region, he told me. The US is, therefore, counting on Pakistan in its efforts to eliminate the terrorist threat. Jones said that if Pakistan was ready to make a strategic commitment to common objectives, the United States was ready to be a partner for the 21st century. The Obama administration had asked for fundamental readjustments before the two countries could be partners for a long time to come. But Islamabad was not ready for them. When Zardari's reply arrived, it had clearly been drafted by a committee of Foreign Office and ISI bureaucrats, repeating old cliches about Afghanistan and the threat to Pakistan from India. Kayani had given Jones his own more than 50-page-long thesis on Pakistan's strategic threats and interests. I was allowed to read it in Islamabad, but no Pakistani civilian was provided a copy to keep. As I read it, it felt familiar. I wondered where I had read it before. Then I realized that its contents were remarkably similar to the paper President Ayub Khan had given President Eisenhower in 1959. Obviously, for Pakistan's permanent institutions of state, nothing had changed in half a century. Pakistan had missed the opening for defining its partnership with the world's sole superpower on more favorable terms than ever before. According to Bob Woodward, Obama told his confidant Tom Donilon in November that he saw the cancer of terrorism as being in Pakistan. The reason we are doing the target, train and transfer in Afghanistan is so the cancer doesn't spread there, the US president reportedly said. We also need to excise the cancer in Pakistan. The New York Times reported Obama's view that it did not matter how many troops were sent to Afghanistan if Pakistan remained a haven. Other reports cited Biden as describing Pakistan as the greater danger over Taliban control of the Afghan countryside. In 2010, Obama deployed several thousand more troops into Afghanistan in what was described as a troop surge, committing the United States to spending an additional $30 billion annually on enhancing its military presence there. The United States would thus make a serious effort to defeat the Taliban insurgency. Efforts for a lasting partnership with Pakistan would continue. Obama wanted to go down in history as a strong US president who did not hesitate to hunt terrorists in farther lands in pursuit of US national interests. After the surge was announced, Holbrooke persisted with his diplomatic efforts to find an Afghan endgame. The strategic dialogue also continued, as did the flow of US economic assistance and coalition support funds. Terrorist attacks inside Pakistan or involving Pakistanis abroad also remained a constant. The most significant of these was the attempt to set off a truck bomb in New York Times Square on May 1, 2010. Although the bomb did not go off, if it had, it could have killed a large number of people. For Americans, this was a reminder of their vulnerability to attacks resembling 9/11. The FBI identified Faisal Shahzad, a 30-year-old Pakistani-American, as the man responsible for the plot. Shahzad told the FBI that he had trained in bomb-making in Pakistan's Waziristan region. For Americans already wary of Pakistan, this was further proof that Pakistan's failure to deal with terrorists was a direct threat to US security. During a meeting at the White House, Jones told me that the Americans considered the Times Square attempted bombing as a successful plot. It was foiled by luck, not intelligence or law enforcement activity. Neither American nor Pakistani intelligence could intercept it, he remarked. US intelligence had reported that other similar plots were underway involving several overlapping and interconnected groups. Pakistan had been helpful in investigating Shahzad and his connections, but the United States wanted Pakistan to help preempt attacks, not just investigate them after the fact. Jones also visited Islamabad, where he conveyed a message from Obama to Zardari and Kayani. The president wanted everyone in Pakistan to understand, he declared, that in case of a successful attack in the US, there are some things even he would not be able to stop. Jones turned the Pakistani refrain about political compulsions on his hosts. Just as there are political realities in Pakistan, there are political realities in the US, he said. The National Security Advisor wanted Pakistanis to understand clearly the message that if a plot succeeds and its origins were traced to Pakistan, no one will be able to stop the response and consequences. In a matter-of-fact tone, he also added that what he had said was not a threat. It was just a statement of political fact. Jones listed 4 specific actions the United States sought from Pakistan. First, the ISI needed to share all intelligence with us, and we will share intelligence with you. Second, there should be immediate sharing of passenger data of flights originating from Pakistan. Third, counter-terrorism cooperation should be enhanced. Fourth, and finally, there should be an end to holding up visas for American intelligence and law enforcement personnel, which is holding up our ability to protect against the terrorists. The ISI claimed that it was already sharing all possible intelligence. Pakistan's Ministry of Defense refused to share flight passenger data, offering only to examine the data itself, which it was presumably doing anyway. The rationale for not allowing Americans to process the data directly was a familiar one. The Americans might monitor the movements of Pakistan's nuclear scientists, Defense Secretary Lieutenant General Athar Ali told me. When US officials offered to let Pakistanis withhold some of the data while sharing the rest, the answer was still no. In the case of visas for US officials, Pakistan's military was averse to the presence of large numbers of Americans in Pakistan. The CIA usually notified the ISI of its operatives working in Pakistan, but the ISI suspected that some of the others, coming as aid workers or diplomatic staff, were also spying on Pakistan. They had no answer to the US assertion that they routinely followed and monitored US officials' activities and did not need to deny visas for officials of an allied country. As a result, hundreds of visa applications were kept pending for months. After Clinton raised the matter with Gilani, the embassy in Washington was allowed discretion in expediting the issuance of visas. But soon reports surfaced in Pakistan that I was issuing visas to CIA operatives to spy on Pakistan. Although we had streamlined the visa process, no visa was issued without following all procedures. The embassy's defense attaché, who reported to the ISI, handled visa requests from the Pentagon and the CIA. Finally, Pasha personally got involved in clearing CIA visas. He claimed that he only wanted to make sure that the ISI knew each CIA operative in Pakistan so they could protect them. But the noise about American spies and the unfounded allegations against me were just meant to keep down the number of Americans in Pakistan. This was hardly the way allies behaved with one another. Then, in the middle of 2010, Pakistan suffered the worst floods in its history. Several million people were affected. A vast number lost their homes. Even though the United States sent several helicopters to assist in the relief effort, Holbrooke ensured that the Americans made the largest contribution to the $1.7 billion flood relief effort and carried travel to the flood-affected areas to show American support. Opinion polls conducted after the floods showed little change in Pakistani anti-Americanism. In October, Kayani arrived in Washington as part of Pakistan's delegation for another round of the strategic dialogue. Jones, who was stepping down as National Security Advisor, proposed that I bring the Foreign Minister, Shah Mahmood Qureshi, and Kayani to meet him on his last day at work. This would be an opportunity for Jones's successor, Tom Donnellan, to meet the Pakistani team, and could also be an occasion for Obama to drop in and deliver in person some key messages to Pakistan's army chief. The meeting took place on October the 20th in the Roosevelt Room of the White House. 15 minutes into the meeting, Obama dropped in and stayed for almost half an hour. He began with polite remarks about US interest in a strong, stable Pakistan and economic support for Pakistani democracy. But then he repeated what Jones had said a few months earlier, and it sounded more ominous coming directly from the President of the United States. Obama said that his greatest concern related to extremists in Pakistan who target the United States, in Afghanistan and the US homeland. If a successful attack is launched by people or groups traced to Pakistan, he said, my hands would be tied. He repeated his invitation to Pakistan to work together in preventing that scenario. I want to deal with this in a way that is respectful for Pakistan's sovereignty, Obama continued. We are mindful of your concerns in your neighborhood and your strategic objectives. In a firm tone, Obama then delivered his core message. The US is not interested in Pakistan being vulnerable, he declared. It cannot, however, accept that your strategic concerns should include support for murderous groups. If Pakistan could build trust around this issue, it would make my job easier in relation to helping Pakistan. He said that if Pakistan and the United States fail to build trust, we will be on collision course. As long as Al-Qaeda and its affiliates operated in Pakistan, this would restrain Pakistan's relations with the United States. Obama addressed Haqqani and said that your intelligence is wrong, that he should fear the United States. Obama decided to address Pakistani conspiracy theories directly. You are hearing from the President of the United States that the US wants a strong, stable Pakistan, he said. It is not in our interest to have a debilitated Pakistan. Qureshi made a long-winded request that Obama should visit Pakistan and that it should equal the length of time he spends visiting India. Haqqani voiced agreement with everything that Obama had said. But he then handed Obama a 12-page paper to explain Pakistan's strategic perspective. Obama went to India in November, skipping Pakistan. Holbrooke died on December the 13th from complications of a torn aorta. I had met him for breakfast at the Four Seasons Hotel in Georgetown the day before he fell ill. He expressed frustration with Pakistan's unwillingness to change. Everyone around the world wonders, what does Pakistan's army want? I wonder if they know themselves, he remarked. Holbrooke said that he intended to continue working for as long as I can to make a difference, and advised me to do the same. Zardari attended the Washington Memorial Service for Holbrooke. Obama then invited him, accompanied only by me, for a meeting in the Oval Office. During the meeting, Obama and Clinton asked Zardari familiar questions about Pakistan's lack of leadership in the war against terror. They also expressed surprise that he had said nothing when a religious fanatic killed his friend Salman Taseer, the governor of Punjab. Zardari tried to explain Pakistan's domestic politics. Clinton continued the conversation, but Obama became quiet. As we left the White House, Zardari asked me if I'd noticed that Obama had switched off. A few days later, US-Pakistan relations began their nosedive with the Raymond Davis affair, in which the US contractor had killed 2 Pakistanis in Lahore when he thought they were trying to rob him, followed by the American raid in Abbottabad. I was on my way to Islamabad from Washington via London and Dubai on the evening of May 1st, 2011, when US Navy SEALs conducted their clandestine operation to kill Osama bin Laden in his fortified compound in Abbottabad. The Americans had kept their plans secret from Pakistan, and no one in our government had any clue about the commando mission. I first learned about bin Laden's death when I turned on my cell phone upon landing at Heathrow Airport in the early morning of May 2nd. Among the many messages waiting for me was one from the foreign minister, instructing me to turn around immediately and return to Washington. While I had slept on my flight to London, Mullen had called Haqqani, and Obama had spoken to Zardari. Although the United States had conducted the operation in complete secrecy and in violation of Pakistani sovereignty, Obama had mentioned Pakistan positively in his speech announcing bin Laden's elimination. The United Nations had declared the Al-Qaeda leader an international terrorist, and any evidence that Pakistan offered him sanctuary would have been a violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1267 and 1373. Mindful of that, Pakistan's initial official response to the event was a statement issued by the Foreign Office describing bin Laden's death as a major setback to terrorist organizations around the world. The statement was issued after a meeting among Zardari, Gilani, and Kayani. It also said the US operation illustrates the resolve of the international community, including Pakistan, to fight and eliminate terrorism. Al-Qaeda had declared war on Pakistan, the statement continued. It added that scores of Al-Qaeda-sponsored terrorist attacks resulted in deaths of thousands of innocent Pakistani men, women, and children, and claimed that Pakistan has played a significant role in efforts to eliminate terrorism. Bin Laden's presence in Pakistan and the US ability to penetrate Pakistan's airspace without our military finding out had embarrassed Pakistan's security. But the Pakistan government, backed by the military, preferred to look upon the incident positively so as to avoid being accused of complicity in protecting the world's most wanted terrorist. Within a couple of days, however, the position in Islamabad began to shift. The ISI and the military faced criticism within and outside the country for their inability to track down bin Laden in a compound close to the Pakistan Military Academy. Some Pakistani critics wondered aloud whether the United States could repeat the success of their undetected commando operation against Pakistan's nuclear installations or other terrorists, such as Taliban leader Mullah Omar, who were believed to be under Pakistani protection. Opposition politicians called for the dismissal of ISI Chief Pasha, resulting in the ISI turning the tables by focusing on how civilian leaders' collaboration had enabled Americans to violate Pakistan's sovereignty. On May the 3rd, Pakistan's Foreign Office issued a second statement, expressing deep concerns and reservations on the manner in which the government of the United States carried out this operation without prior information or authorization from the government of Pakistan. But this statement still recognized the death of Osama bin Laden as an important milestone in the fight against terrorism, and insisted that the government of Pakistan and its state institutions have been making serious efforts to bring him to justice. However, by then, Islamists and hardliners in the military, who described the operation against bin Laden as a US aggression on Pakistani soil, were swaying Pakistani public opinion. Instead of blaming the military for failing to detect bin Laden's presence, as well as the US operation to kill him, the ISI diverted the Pakistani media's attention to fabrications that the elected civilians had helped the CIA create a massive intelligence-gathering network within Pakistan. Parallel Gallup polls in Pakistan and the United States soon after bin Laden's killing showed the wide gap between the two nations' views. 2/3 of Pakistanis polled condemned the US military action, contrasting with Americans' nearly universal approval. A Pew poll a month later showed that a majority of Pakistanis thought it was a bad thing that Osama bin Laden had been killed at all. The Pakistani public was responding to what Pakistan's media told them. The airwaves were clogged with sentiments about how the United States had violated Pakistan's borders and should, therefore, be deemed its enemy. Some media persons spoke of bin Laden as a Muslim hero, and others claimed that he had not been killed in the US operation, but rather had died of natural causes earlier. According to this last bizarre theory, the Americans had frozen bin Laden's body, only to use it later to proclaim success at a time that suited the US government. The Obama administration felt the Pakistan government was doing little to inform Pakistan's people of the importance of bin Laden's elimination. Some US officials saw the ISI's hand behind the orchestration of anti-American protests and hinted that it wanted to avoid scrutiny of its complicity or incompetence in bin Laden's presence in Pakistan. The most benign theory about bin Laden hiding in Pakistan suggested that the ISI had failed to look for him, while ISI-protected Pakistani jihadi groups offered him sanctuary without telling their contacts within the government. Soon after the Abbottabad raid, Grossman and CIA Deputy Director Michael Morrell travelled to Islamabad to propose actions that Pakistan could take to build confidence in its commitment to fight terrorism. They shared intelligence about a bomb-making factory run by their Haqqani network in North Waziristan. According to the CIA, Al-Qaeda, as well as the Taliban and Pakistani jihadi groups, used improvised explosive devices, IEDs, made at this factory. Kayani and Pasha promised that the Pakistan army would send in troops to shut down the illicit factory that was manufacturing the IEDs. A few days later, the CIA sent time-stamped photographs showing the facility being dismantled hours before the army's arrival. The dismantling began after a man on a motorcycle went into the factory, thus leading to speculation that he had come to tip off the terrorists about the impending army operation. The Americans concluded that Pakistan's failure to combat terrorism went beyond its law enforcement agencies and armed forces incompetence. They saw the ISI as deeply penetrated by jihadist sympathizers, and the civilian government as unable to make firm decisions because of fear of public opinion, which was manipulated to prevent closer US-Pakistan cooperation against terrorism. In the aftermath of the US operation against bin Laden, I made several attempts to bridge the gulf between the American and Pakistani understanding of each other's positions. But there was little willingness in Islamabad to accept that there was anything wrong on our end that needed to be fixed. The Abbottabad raid had caused Americans to see Pakistan negatively, and the average American now saw it as Osama bin Laden's sanctuary. I reported to the Pakistan government testy conversations with congressmen in which they said that voting for aid for Pakistan was becoming difficult because their constituents were not willing to support a country they saw as an enemy. Senator Mark Kirk, a Republican from Illinois, told me frankly that he and many of his colleagues saw Pasha as a bold-faced liar. But Pakistani officials rejected every US criticism or suggestion as manifesting American arrogance. Then in September, Admiral Mullen decided to publicly voice his vexation with the Pakistan Army's unwillingness to be honest in its dealings with America. He had spent 4 years cultivating a friendship with Kayani, meeting the Pakistani general 26 times. In congressional testimony, Mullen described the Afghan Haqqani terrorist network as a veritable arm of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. He said support for extremist groups, including the Haqqani network and anti-Indian terror organization Lashkar-e-Taiba, was part of the Pakistani government's policy and served Islamabad's interests. The support of terrorism is part of their national strategy, Mullen observed. For Kayani and other Pakistani generals, Mullen's statement should have served as a warning that anger toward Pakistan was not limited to US politicians. The US military, which had traditionally cultivated close ties with Pakistan, was also now losing patience. But there was no change in the generals' attitude either, probably because of their belief that the United States needed Pakistan for its disengagement from Afghanistan, and would therefore continue to tolerate its support for some militant groups. By November 2011, I myself had become a victim of the mistrust and misunderstanding between the two nations. A US businessman of Pakistani origin, now residing in Monaco, claimed in an article that I had asked him to deliver a secret memo to Mullen, seeking US help in thwarting a military coup right after the US operation that killed bin Laden. Kayani and Pasha claimed that their inquiries supported my accuser's claim. The Pakistani media dubbed the affair Memogate. To prove my fidelity to Pakistan, I returned to Islamabad and resigned from my position as ambassador. Pakistan's Supreme Court, without regard to legal or constitutional niceties, intervened directly. Without any trial, it created a commission of inquiry and barred me from leaving Pakistan. For 2 months, I remained holed up, first in the presidential palace and later in the Prime Minister's house. I had not been charged with any crime, but was nonetheless being portrayed as a traitor who sought foreign help against my own country's army. I feared that a terrorist would kill me if I went out. Eventually, the court relented and allowed me to leave Pakistan. Several months later, the Commission of Inquiry alleged that I had acted against Pakistan's interests and had authorized the controversial memo. Pakistani hardliners claimed I was an American agent of influence with access in Washington's power corridors. Were that true, there would have been no reason for me to seek help, certainly not from a disreputable businessman, to deliver a message to the US government. To date, more than a year later, I have not been charged or tried. However, the Commission's report could lead to charges of treason, a conviction that carries the death penalty. My sincere efforts to transcend the parallel narratives that have shaped US-Pakistani relations were not always appreciated in Pakistan, where conspiracy theories and hatred for the United States have become a daily staple of the national discourse. My detractors in Pakistan's security services and among pro-jihadi groups have long accused me of being pro-American. They fail to see that advocating a different vision for my troubled nation was actually pro-Pakistan. The expectation that Washington should simply do whatever the Pakistani hyper-nationalists desired remains unrealistic, as it has since 1947. My countrymen will someday have to come to terms with global realities. Pakistan cannot become a regional leader in South Asia while it supports terrorism. To think that the United States would indefinitely provide economic and military assistance in return for partial support of US objectives is delusional. Americans must also overcome their fantasy that aid always translates into leverage, and that personal relations with foreign officials can change what those officials consider to be their national priorities. If the Pakistanis have been reticent in their cooperation, Americans have resorted only to half-hearted sanctions. Successive administrations have waited until their last few months in office to deliver the toughest messages. By then, however, it is usually too late for threats to be effective. The history of constant misunderstandings confirms that Pakistan and the United States have few shared interests and very different political needs. Just because they don't get along does not mean they must be antagonists, however. They should just lower their expectations of one another, inject a cautious wariness in their future plans, and recognize that their electorates are fatigued by the other. Pakistan cannot pursue its dreams of being India's military equal by seeking American aid. If $40 billion in US aid has not won Pakistani hearts and minds, billions more will not do the trick. Unless Pakistanis define their national interest differently from how their leaders have for over 6 decades, the US-Pakistan alliance is only a mirage. The relationship needs redefinition, based on a recognition of divergent interests and an acknowledgement of mutual mistrust. Only then will Pakistan and the United States share the same reality.